Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. We are diving back into Gospel of John. I missed it dearly doing meetups on this. And this time I'm focusing on my favorite part of it. Of course, my favorite part is John 1, but after that, it is these chapters 13 through 17, generally known as the farewell discourse. Now, I want to tell you that it's a very deep work. It's very profound, and I'm just beginning to skim the surface of it. I'm grateful to my friend Baron for introducing me to Gospel of John and helping me, by reading the Bible, New Testament, Old Testament with me. It's been really wonderful. But it's been only a year since I've been reading this, so my knowledge of it is very limited. But what I speak is not from scholarship. I'm not a scholar. What I speak is because I love this work, and I'm just speaking from that. So please take it as such. All right, so let me get started. Now, the interesting thing is how the story of how we started doing this gospel, because we had just finished our meetups on Bhagavad Gita. And we spent 2 days each week looking at deep spiritual issues about the center of our being and our expression in emotions, in thoughts, in action, and how these go together. And when those meetups stopped, I wanted to continue that. And that's why, I decided to go back to Gospel of John. Now, the other reason is that we had not finished Gospel of John. And we had started with Aquinas' commentary. And I was stunned by the depth of Aquinas' commentary. So I want to continue that of looking, the process of looking at Aquinas. Now, why these chapters? So I'm going to be talking about just, why these chapters. And today we are going to be talking about verses 1 through 11. So how about we have some people read the verses? Penny or Brian, do you have the verses ready? But Baron, do you have? Can you read from 1 to 11? Baron, go ahead. And then it'll be Penny. Baron, go ahead.
Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Jesus answered him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "The one who is bathed does not need to wash, except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, "Not all of you are clean."
Thank you. Next up is Penny. Penny, go ahead.
Okay. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "A person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean.
Thank you, Penny. So the format is I'll make some comments, then we're going to have a presentation by Gary, who's just finished his master's thesis on chapter 13. Then we will go to Evanique, Baron, Brian, Penny, and Joe for their comments on these verses. And then we will open it up for anybody else who wants to comment, after which we'll have a general discussion. This is very difficult, so I'm going to try my best, and I'm going to now speak without any disclaimers. I'm just going to speak as best as I understand this. My comments are divided into three parts. The first one I'm calling problem and solution. The second one I'm calling feet and heart. And the third one I'm calling family and love. So first, problem and solution. Jesus has realized that it's his time. His time has come. That he has to go back. He's going back to the Father. Look at the immensity of the problem. He has come into the world. His people have rejected him. A whole bunch of them want to kill him. All he has now are these 12 disciples, such as they are. You know, there is Judas, there are people who are going to deny him, there are people who are going to scatter. That's all he has. He still has to accomplish his mission. How does he do it? That is the problem. The solution, it is the passage. It is the Passover. It is Passover in so many different senses. This is Aquinas' point. It is a crucial idea that this is a Passover. It is his passage from this world to the Father. He is leading his disciples through this solution to the Father. He's being Moses, who's leading people to the promised land. So that is what he needs to do. And how does he do it? If I have to say it in one sentence, God washes man's feet. God washes man's feet. Now this, if you want to really think about it, you know, I like to put myself in that position. Suppose I was one of these 12. And God started washing my feet. What would happen to me? What would happen to me? Here, Aquinas is brilliant. He says feet is our sensuality, our emotional connection to things of this world. Washing of feet. On one hand, it is similar to the baptism that John the Baptist is doing. It is washing away of the sins. But it is more. Because it is Jesus who is washing the feet. The emotion moves from the feet to the heart. It generates love for this great being who is doing that. And Holy Spirit is nothing but that. So Jesus, by washing the feet of his disciples, is producing, the moment you put yourself in that position, that's what you would feel. You would feel this immense love. And that is the Holy Spirit. It is the love for Jesus. It is the love for God. It's very interesting. So it is the washing away of the sin. It is the Lamb of God that is being the shepherd in this very action. It is Passover. It is the Lamb who knows is going to be sacrificed. And he's being the shepherd in that one action. Third point, family and love. Just one addition to the feet and heart point. Aquinas points out about the point about washing of hands and the head. He says, head is reason and hand is your works. What the disciples already have are the words, the thoughts of Jesus, and the illustration of the works of Jesus, that somebody like Peter already has that. But he needs that Holy Spirit. He needs that heart driving, using that way in order to get to God. Third point, family and love. Again, think for a moment. Suppose you have a little brother, 2-year-old. You are 12. He comes in from the garden, his feet are dirty. Won't you wash them? Would you consider it? Would you consider it beneath you to wash the feet? If your big brother was doing that for your little brother, wouldn't you be inspired to do the same? This is an invitation into the family of God. In this simple action, single action, God washes man's feet. In it is contained this invitation. Now it is very interesting what Peter says. Peter says, no. How can you wash my feet? Deep point here is that grace from God is raining on you all the time. That is just what it is. And you have to accept it, say yes to it, and love God in return. What could be more than God so loved the world that he sent his only son here? Isn't that an illustration, a profound illustration of God considering us as children, of his children? So these are some of the things that this entire sequence starts with. But I think this entire sequence is contained in that single action. And the full meaning of it is explained and explicated in chapters 13 through 17. Thank you. Next up is Gary. Gary, go ahead.
Hello, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
So I prepared a set of slides, and quite frankly, your presentation was so moving that I'm afraid to go forward a little bit because it's much more academic.
Please go ahead. We would love to hear. I'm not academic. I don't know much, so please go ahead.
So I'll try to explain it as best as I could. And then I think I can't remember who it was, but was Brian a former ethics teacher, if I recall correctly?
Yes.
And so I'm open to his critique because I think he spoke up last time when I presented, and I really appreciated what he had to say. And it made me really hit the books a little bit harder. So I'll share screen, and we'll see if these work. And can you guys see that?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
All right, fantastic. So it's probably the best way to describe it as a multi-dimensional approach to scripture, in that it has a variety of contexts. And so there's something really unique when we deal with the Old Testament and the New Testament, is that you have three historical settings that are taking place simultaneously. Jesus' ministry is in the 30s CE, but the apostle isn't writing until like 90 CE. And so a great amount of time has transpired, and the socio-political environment of the world has transformed drastically. And that distance between the event and the time of his writing gives him a perspective to where he's targeting those enduring truths that continue to be applicable, that are beyond, just he's not concerned just to record the history as such. He's interpreting history, and so he's drawing out, he's selectively pulling things out. And like a good writer, this is what anybody does, is he also has the wherewithal to realize that he's writing for posterity, and that the readership of this gospel are going to include us. He has no idea who we are, but he knows that people in the future are going to need these enduring truths. And so by analogy, has anybody heard of the Christmas Story, that movie that plays every Christmas? It's a movie about a Christmas in the 1950s. It was filmed sometime in the 80s. And here in the 2000s, we still watch it every year, and it has like these enduring truths. And that's literally what's taking place with the Gospel of John, or almost every aspect of the of the Bible is after the fact, sometimes centuries after the fact, they're writing a history about something in the past with the idea of communicating enduring truths for the future. Is that pretty clear?
Yep, go ahead.
The other thing is my professors tell me to be careful using the word myth. Nowadays, when we say myth, we mean that it's not true, it's fake, it's a story. But myth is a genre of literature, and it's very very specific. It's something that was used. If you probably you said that you discussed Walter Ong's book and his work previously, and so we know that in oral cultures, their quote unquote literature, which was passed on, orally by memory, took the form of stories, and stories had to capture the truths of a society. And so the same thing is really happening when we look at the story of the Gospel of John, is we have some very profound truths that are being maintained in story form, but it's not just the Gospel of John. Is this an extension of the Jewish mythic tradition that goes all the way back? And something that's particular about them is that there's a lot of assumed knowledge. And so he might just casually reference something or assume that you know what he's talking about, but he's pulling in like this wealth of tradition from the past. And so it takes a very, you almost have to be a well-informed reader to get at everything that's taking place. For instance, one of the examples is simply the foot washing. The first instance of foot washing takes place in Genesis, and it continues throughout Jewish tradition as being a hospitality ritual. And then it's prominent in both Jewish and Greco-Roman Hellenistic traditions. And so we have this whole wealth of the tradition of foot washing that is now being, and I have the word here, is recapitulated. It's being re-envisioned and re-enlivened in this moment, in this story that's going on here. The other thing, and this is something unique to the Gospel of John that I don't know that people really catch, is that as the last gospel, he's fully aware of the synoptic tradition. Paul wrote his epistles 30 or 40 years previously. And so when we read the Gospel of John, there's assumed knowledge about even Christian traditions. For instance, the baptism is recorded in all the Gospels. John doesn't mention the baptism, but he assumes that it took place and that we know that it happened when he talks about John the Baptist. Similarly with the Last Supper, there's foot washing, but there's no Lord's Supper, there's no Eucharist. He's not ignorant of it, he's fully aware of that. And then finally, there's this thing in literature, and actually in all the humanities, probably in the later part of the 20th century, called the ethical turn, where we're discussing whether it's psychology or cultural anthropology, and now it's starting to be in biblical studies, is that ethics isn't just some subgenre or some sub-study, but rather we need to refocus our direction and ask, like, this material has ethical intent, maybe primarily. We have to make that our primary focus going into it. Which leads us to some things is are the ethics simply descriptive? Are we only talking about Christians and a Christian community? Or is John making generalized truths about the world? And so there's this distinction when we talk about ethics, the distinction between what we say is the descriptive ethics or a normative ethics. Is how broad is John being? Is he only talking about a little context, these little Christian community? Or does he mean all Christians for all time? Or is he talking about an ethic that all of us should be following? So those are the debates there. And I'm only telling you about those three contexts. So when I approach John, that's the broad historical context. I'm looking at these three histories that are taking place simultaneously. And then it's not just the verse here, it's as an extension of a mythic tradition that begins with early Judaism and extends to the present. And in that sense, as readers of the text, and especially as Christians, we're not just reading something that happened in the past. We're actually participating in it. That we see ourselves as our own feet are being washed, is what's taking place here. Is that it's a recapitulation, is the word that I use, of the Old Testament traditions. They're being reimagined in our own lives in this present. And so these are just like some examples as the historic context. We'd have to look at that. The enduring intent of the text is what I was saying, is like John knows that this text is going to be read long after he's gone. He's probably an old man already when he writes it. And so he's writing to have enduring truths that carry on without him. And this I already kind of talked about. But what's important for me, Shrikant, is that in the very first 3 verses there is we have this mythic context in the identity of Jesus coming from the Father and returning to the Father. He's not just a person or a great teacher. Is the prologue, you said that's your favorite part of the gospel. The prologue is being imported right here. He's reminding us of the prologue and the identity of Jesus. And so there's this wealth, and he's just doing it obliquely. He's just like saying this happened, but he's importing this whole wealth of tradition right here. And so whatever takes place next, it's in the context of the identity of Jesus as exemplified in the prologue. The presence of Satan also introduces this idea of a cosmic struggle. This isn't just Jesus washing people's feet. This is not a vignette. This is a cosmic battle that's taking place between light and dark. And something very significant is happening at this farewell. That's going to be explained in the farewell discourse. And that is happening through this foot washing. This is where I'm part of a minority opinion on it, but there's a little bit of discussion on it, is the transfiguration is in all 3 of the Gospels, where Jesus ascends onto a mountain. He's covered in a cloud. His clothes become white as light. A voice comes from heaven and speaks, and they see the splendor. The Greek word is doxa, the splendorous revelation of God's glory. And John doesn't have it. But he has the foot washing, where he makes a special attention to how Jesus disrobes and puts on the clothing of a slave, of a servant, and then wraps himself in this towel and goes through all of this. And so you have kind of this inverse transfiguration, the exact opposite. Rather than seeing his splendor, the splendor of God is revealed through his humility, is what's taking place there. And all the other transfiguration language is present in chapter 12 leading up to this. We have the loud moving voice from heaven. He says, now is the hour. And when he says now is the hour, he says that in response to a request from the Greeks where they say, we want to see Jesus. And so it's preparing you to have revealed the doxa of God, the splendor of God. And then the very next scene is the foot washing. Coincidentally, or maybe intentionally by John, it's Philip who goes, to Jesus and carries the message of the Greeks. And in the farewell discourse, it's Philip that says to Jesus, show us the Father. And Jesus says, have you been with me such a short time that you don't realize that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father? So it's really capturing that whole idea of seeing God's glory is being manifest in the life and ministry of Jesus, and is best exemplified through the foot washing. I have a little thing here on the Greek kleos and time, which are oftentimes referred to as victory in battle, is the glory that you get. And time are the spoils that one gets, oftentimes in the forms of human booty, like slaves or whatever else. If you're familiar at all with the Iliad, that's the scenario, is Achilles and Agamemnon are both angry with each other because they've been slighted. They both had to give up their slaves. And so their honor and everything is besmirched. In the farewell discourse, it's really interesting because Jesus talks about saying, all that the Father has given me, I have not lost a one, except for the son of perdition, so that the scripture might be fulfilled. And so if you read it as a conversation with the Iliad, you have Jesus revealing his glory in a very similar way, and also having all of these people, all those who are saved are his, and he will not let them go. And so he has an honor that has not been besmirched. Similarly, well, I'll move on to that later. There's the gospel is a work of narrative theology. And this is kind of significant that we kind of forget. We have a modern post-Enlightenment concept of history, and prior to the Enlightenment, people didn't go ahead and record history simply as a calculation of facts to say this is what happened when so and so did it and this was in the battle and memorize all the dates. Is history was almost always interpreted. You recorded history because you had a reason and a purpose behind it. Oftentimes to communicate your own values, sometimes to reinforce the values of a society, sometimes to learn a historical lesson, but it was never history as such. And so when we look to the Bible, that's kind of the important thing to notice is that, as a conservative, I'll say that it's historically accurate. I have no problem with that, but we have to understand that it's selected and framed in a certain way to communicate the theology is what's important to John. And so the things that are in there that are selected, the items that he uses, the places that he describes, all have a theological context. And so that's the other question is I have here as example, a little bit of the ethical thing is there's a debate as to whether or not John's gospel is ethical at all. For many years, people said that the only command in John is the command to love, and that's not enough to go by. And so maybe there's no ethics in the Gospel of John. And so sometimes that debate is I have it listed here as the difference between what is descriptive and normative. Sometimes people thought that it was specifically a command that was only for Christians within the Christian community, and that it had no intention, Jesus had no intention that the disciples should love anybody outside. That was a common theme for a long time. I think it's errant. It's wrong. But the actual ethics of John are captured in the person and work of Jesus. Like the command to love has meaning in the broader context of Jesus' identity, in the context of what we call this narrative theology. And that's what really brings the meaning into it. Just like you were saying, Shrikant, as you're describing like family and love, all of these things, it's more than can be captured in simply a command to love one another. The narrative, the story there is what really communicates the true intent of that command. And so then I just have just a few points and then I'm done. The foot washing as described, we look at it ignorant of foot washing traditions. But this is unprecedented. That for a master to come and wash the disciples' feet is not something that we scour the literature. We don't see anything quite like this. Moreover, this is the work of female slaves. If a male slave is being asked to wash feet, that's as lowly as a slave is, that's considered a slight to his ego and his status. He's being asked to do something that is beneath him. And so there's an aspect here of Jesus isn't just engaging in an act of humble service, and his relinquishing of his identity isn't just in assuming the role of a slave, as they quote in Philippians and Hebrews. He's actually surrendering even his gender in this thing. And slaves had no barriers that needed to be respected in any sense. To take it a step further, early Christians were very, very concerned with sexual purity. And there was a debate as to whether or not it was considered impure to have sex with your female slaves, because it was just the norm. That's what the female slaves were for. So it was a debate. And so Jesus is there not just as a slave, but as the most vulnerable aspect of what a slave could possibly be. And so there's that absurdity of what's taking place when Peter says, "Never shall you wash my feet." It's also happening in the middle of the meal. It's supposed to happen in the very beginning. So the entire social order is being upended in this foot washing. And so I have it listed as a form of ego dissolution. Same thing as this transfiguration. There's so many transfiguration parallels. And it's saying that the splendor or the glory of God is revealed through this ego dissolution, and not through what, the time and the kleos and all these Greek concepts of glory and the ways that we normally discuss it. Throughout John, there's at least two instances where it specifically says that Jesus sought not the glory that the men seek. So he understands a distinction between a secular and a religious context for glory. The other thing is ethics. This is something that recently in the last 50, 60 years or so, we're starting to re-envision is, and Aquinas kind of does it with his work on Aristotle, is the idea of virtue ethics. And virtue ethics is less concerned with your actions, what you do, and more concerned with your identity and your moral transformation. It's who you are to become. This wonderful man, his name is Charles Taylor, wrote a book called Sources of the Self, and that's his premise behind it. Is he discusses like ethics, at least in the first century, is about who you are becoming, and then what you do flows through that. Another aspect is this idea of imitation, which they refer to as mimesis, and I have it listed as the mimetic formula. In the New Testament, when we have mimesis, and imitation, especially if it's associated with a command, there's a specific example that's given, and then a very specific and directed command. And in the context of the foot washing, the command is John 13:34, love one another as I have loved you, which he repeats again in John 15:12 when he gives the true vine discourse. And then that command is explained through the foot washing. And then when we get to the true vine, that command is reiterated and it's explained through the analogy of the true vine. Here's a thing that I saw, and I might be stretching a little bit beyond, is that lots of times when people read it, they ask the question, is this an ordinance for the church? Are we supposed to go around literally washing people's feet? Because it has a lot of this ordinance language. And the Catholic Church has a yearly tradition where the priest will go and wash the feet of the laity in deference to this. What I brought up before is that the Eucharistic language is present here. Even though John doesn't talk about the Eucharist, but he refers to the foot washing in the same language. He says, do it just as I have done. And the Eucharist, he's like, do this in remembrance of me. Similarly, we have this idea of the new covenant when he talks about the Eucharist, but here he talks about the new commandment to love. And so I'm pitching the idea, at least in my thesis, is that the Eucharist is not limited to simply a memorial of Jesus' death, but it's also a reminder of our duty to follow his example. Is that the same ego dissolution that Jesus engaged in that led him to the cross is the very same thing that we're supposed to engage in when we serve others, is the relinquishing of all of our status. I said I was going to talk about it, and so this is where we're at. Farewell discourses are another genre of literature. Again, Moses gives a farewell discourse, Joshua gives a farewell discourse, Jacob gives a farewell discourse about his 12 sons. And we see it throughout Greco-Roman literature also. Here, if we're looking at it as cosmic battle, light and dark, and the introduction of Satan and all this happening, another form of farewell discourse is the orders that a general gives to his troops before battle. And so in that context, when Jesus is washing their feet, he's literally saying, this is what it means to fight that spiritual battle. This is what it means to engage in the powers of darkness in this world, is to humble yourself to this point. The Eastern Church has a tradition, and actually goes back to Irenaeus, of something called theosis, which is a reference to the divination of the believer, the way in which we become more like God. And so this is kind of something it's interesting to explore, and it's probably most fully brought out in the True Vine Discourse, when it talks about Jesus being the true vine and the believers being branches that bear fruit coming out of it. So this is what I think is really kind of the whole point of where it's going, is our own divine nature is what's being explored through this whole foot washing, and our call to be like Jesus. And that's it. I have this funny little cartoon.
Thank you, Gary. Wonderful. All right. Next up is going to be, now folks, go ahead and make your comments. So next up is going to be Evanique, followed by Baron, Brian, Penny, and Joe, and then anybody else who wants to speak. Evanique, go ahead.
So, first of all, thank you, Gary, for that. That really was enlightening. So I'm just going to go through like my notes from reading the Gospel of John and the Aquinas commentary. Just trying to get to the first page. So, the first thing I noticed is about service. And the thing that struck me is that not only are we called to service, but we are also called to be served. And I was thinking of Peter saying, no, Jesus, you can't wash my feet. Like, no, I can't be served. Like, there is a certain humbling of that. And I agree with what everybody said. Like, Jesus is the master. Like, there's no way you're going to wash my feet. But it shows to me true leadership, and that a true leader serves the people. They don't consider themselves to be above anybody. And I think Gary brought up a great point, which I wasn't even aware of, is when you're talking about Jesus took the form not only of a slave, but a female slave, like in taking on the duties of a female slave and washing the feet. Like even the male slave would consider that to be beneath him. But Jesus chose to serve everyone. And I think that's the mark of a true leader. And the mark of a true leader also allowed himself to be served. When Jesus allowed the woman when she broke the vase and anointed him for his death, he was allowing himself to be served. So I think that was the first thing that struck me. And then like what this signified to me was that we are not independent of each other. That we would love to say, especially in the West, that we are independent, pull yourself by your bootstraps. And it just doesn't support what Christ says. We're not independent of each other. We need each other. So that was the first point. And then second point is about keeping clean. Even if you have good intentions, you must keep yourself clean. And the washing of the feet signifies that. You talked about it before. The feet being connected to the earth and the sensuality and the desires of this world and the attachments, like we also talked about in the Gita, the attachments to this world. And, I look at it as every day you have to purify yourself. Every day you have to take a look at your motives and see where you need to change, or, what am I holding on to that no longer serves me? I think with the whole body reference that Aquinas uses, that Judas was, his whole body was in this earth. It wasn't just his feet, it was the whole thing. And that's why Jesus makes the point of, you just need your feet cleaned. You don't need the whole body cleaned. But if you just immerse yourself in this world and you don't have a spiritual base, that's all you're focused on is the world. And then, and so to me, it was just a great, profound point. To check on yourself to see where you're at. And then in Aquinas, in Romans 6:10, it says, the life he lives to God. And I was thinking that's the whole point, like devote yourself to God. You're not going to be perfect. A lot of times people are like, do not sin. That's never going to happen. But if you devote yourself to God, your motives are good. We talked about values in these meetups too. If you're sticking to your values, if you're sticking to your morals, that you set up for yourself, then, you're devoting yourself to God or to something spiritual. And then when he talks about when Judas experienced Christ's love and he chose to betray him, and then Christ, knowing that Judas was going to betray him and Peter was going to deny him and disciples were going to run away, he still chose love. And that is the bravest thing in the world, to choose love, even though you know people are going to hurt you. You know people are going to betray you. You know, that was the example that Jesus was setting. And to me, that is braver than going into war. And I know that sounds crazy, and I'm not like trying to diminish people who go into war. Trust me, I'm not. But to love someone that is, you know, is going to hurt you, to choose to love someone that you know is going to hurt you, to choose to love someone that you know is going to betray you, that takes heart. You know, I'm getting there, but I'm not there yet. And then in note 1745, Aquinas talks about being a good servant. To notice anything that might be lacking in your service. And two, not to be encumbered. And when he's talking about that, he's talking about Jesus' clothing. And I thought that was significant because when I was watching the Gospel of John being narrated like in film form on YouTube, there's a YouTube video that you can watch that narrates the Gospel of John, but they do it in visual form, and they do it in the setting that Jesus would be. And the one thing that struck me was that I didn't realize it, but Jesus was shirtless when he was washing the disciples' feet. He took off his tunic. How revealing is that? That he just revealed himself to his disciples, that he chose to be exposed like that at a time where I don't think that was ever done. I don't think so. But it just teaches us not to be encumbered, not to, try to make ourselves to be something that we're not. But not only that, but to be vulnerable. And, not be vulnerable, meaning being naive. To me, it's like, don't be vulnerable. I mean, it's like being vulnerable with your eyes wide open, knowing what could happen and still doing it. And then he says being prepared, making sure that he had everything that he needed for service. I think of that, and I think of Jesus in the garden. He had to get ready to go through what he was going to go through. He had to ask God, do I have to do this? He had to prepare himself for what he was about to do. He had to prepare himself for the ultimate service. And I just thought, wow, like that's what it made me think of. And then the mystical aspect of it, Aquinas talks about it in 1748, that Christ's blood was poured out for each of us, just like water being poured in the basin, and that the blood of Jesus purifying us. He poured himself out for us to be purified. But we still have to make the choice. Like you were saying, Sharikant, and like it talks about in the Gita as well, you have to make the choice to follow him. And I bring Judas back up because Judas chose different. He chose not to follow Jesus. He could have even followed Jesus after he betrayed him. Like the deed had been done by the time Jesus called him out on it. He had already accepted the money. All he had to do was just do this last act. And even then he could have repented. Even then he could have said, I'm sorry. Even then, even though it was in play and they knew what to do, he already told them where he was. It would have still went down. He still would have been crucified, but he could have chose to say, I'm sorry, and just not do what he did, do that last part, but he chose that. And then it says the part where he talks about and began to wash, and it shows the human imperfection. I already talked about this. I'm just going to skip that part. And then the last part I want to talk about is Peter's zeal, because I thought that was really important. It says, like Peter's zeal in saying, you shall never wash my feet. Aquinas describes it as an impatient and disordered zeal. And he gives 3 reasons. Peter refuses something that was beneficial and necessary. He didn't take the time to think, I need this, right? I need to be purified. He was just like, oh, no. Like he was just caught up in appearances for that moment. Like, no, the master will never wash my feet. It's just like saying, no, I won't accept your help. No, I won't accept you helping to make me clean. And then he said he wanted to go against God's plans. We do it all the time. We want to do it on our own. We want to take things upon ourselves to do. Peter was like that. He was refusing, in a sense, he was refusing Christ's love at that moment, just to keep up airs, just to keep up appearances. And then finally, it's he's disparaging his companions, which I thought was really interesting because, all his other companions accepted it, but not him. Like it kind of was putting himself above them. Like, you guys let the master wash your feet. I will not. I will not do that. And I was like, well, then Christ tells him that you can't be a part of my kingdom. And I just thought that was profound. So there was a lot of things I learned, and there was a lot of things I learned in Gary's presentation that I did not know. And especially about, I knew John was the last gospel to be written. I just didn't, it just didn't dawn on me the experience John had. He had seen Christ die. He had seen the beginnings of Christianity before he started writing this book. And, he was in the beginning throes of it. And I didn't know that it was written after Paul's epistles. So that was very interesting. And especially about the female slave, that Christ took on the role of a female slave. Like, imagine how scandalous that is. Even though, you think about it, and there were women that were with him that saw this. Like, he didn't care about that. Like, the ego was gone. He didn't have the ego that we have. So that's my presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Evanique. Really appreciate it. I have many points and would love to, we'll discuss it afterwards. Next up is going to be Baron, followed by Brian. Baron.
I just want to say first that this has been amazing so far. Just, wow. These have been good before, but this is, yeah. Gary mentioned Philippians, and I think there's a passage that I want to read from there that's, I think, very similar to this. And I think it'll be very obvious, actually, but let me read it. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. That each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And I think this is so parallel to what's going on in John, and what's going on in John is revealing that physically in an amazing way. He lays aside his outer garments, just like, he lays aside his, all the divine status that he can, hold on to. He lays that aside and takes the form of a servant by washing it, laying aside, his outer glory. And then he does the ultimate act of a servant. And then he resumes his garments and goes back to eating with them. And he says to them, you say that I am Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I, then your Lord and teacher, have done this, so you should also. And even the passage says that every knee will, every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. So you have, I think, strong parallels here. Maybe John even knew this work of Paul and was doing this intentionally. At the very least, God was planning that, and like the themes of like incarnation and humility, and this being an example, are like all in both of these. And I think it's really, really beautiful to have that. Like, just the thing in Philippians is beautiful, having it's somewhat abstract, but it's not too out of reach, but then to have it so illustrated in John physically is so much on top of that. I think that like the language it uses, he knows that the Father has given all things into his hands. So, and then he uses his very hands to wash their feet. I think that, yeah, I think that, Evanique mentioned, he had his shirt off. He was to an extent disrobed in front of them, and that's kind of laying like showing humility and and in some sense taking on shame. And on the cross he will be stripped of his garments and he'll be in the same situation. And then he'll go to the tomb where he'll have linen on him, just like and so I think it's just amazing how everything that he's doing is a picture of his his greatest work that he's doing. It's ultimately his work on the cross, which is the main thing. It's not the foot washing in a sense, but the foot washing is depicting and encapsulating that in such a beautiful way. I think also Evanique mentioned the woman washing his feet, and I think it's very parallel because it happens in John 12. It's at a meal before the Passover, and there's washing of feet, and a lot of the same themes that Jesus is talking about his death. And she washes his feet, with this precious ointment. But what Christ does to cleanse his people is with something even more precious. It's with his own blood. And I think that the value of the nard is emphasized to a great degree. And why is it focusing so much on the liquid? It's Christ is symbolically here doing that same thing. And I think in both of these, we see like Judas, he was not willing to, when the woman washed his feet with the nard, he's like, why was this not given to the poor? He's rejecting the service of the Lord. Whereas Peter is rejecting the Lord's service to him. And Peter does this, when after the transfiguration, where Jesus says, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hand, and talks about his death and crucifixion, which is going to happen. And Peter says, this will never happen. Far be it from you. And Jesus rebukes him there. And so we have Judas doing, rejecting that, Peter rejecting that. And they're precisely the two ones. Judas is the one who betrays him, and Peter denies him. And I think that, it's very parallel, and there's like a beauty to it about how, Christ rightfully, receives this, and it's not good to withhold him that, but it's also not good to withhold what he wants to do for you, which is of course, the far greater act. I think about, why feet? I think part of it is, so the feet, we walk on the earth, we walk in the dirt with our feet, of course, and that's, one of the most unclean, parts. And, back in Genesis, God, says to Adam, cursed be the ground for your sake. So it's the feet that walk in the cursed earth. That's the part of us that, is kind of touching that curse that Christ, is going and cleaning. And I think that that's at least some of the, it seems to me, significance of the feet here. I think that's all that I have. But
Thanks, Baron. Next up is going to be Brian. Brian, go ahead.
So thank you very much. I thought that was great. I really appreciate it. I had trouble keeping up with it all, so let me put that out there. But I don't know, I could comment on different levels. Since I'll just say as an academic, what is your thesis in this?
Let's do one thing. Right now, just say what you got from these verses. We're going to have a full discussion on all the points made after everybody has had to say their piece. So please go ahead and talk about what you got from these verses.
Okay. I think it's great. I think that Jesus is setting a great example. I think it really draws a distinction between the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and the model and calling of Jesus, which is do unto others as I have done unto you. That sets a higher standard, since he was setting a higher standard. And it seems that yes, it does seem to establish that you must be open to receiving in exactly the way Evanique had talked about, and I think Shrikant touched on that, and we've talked a lot about that in the 52 Living Ideas. So I really do think that is important. Those are really the two big things that I got out of it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. Thank you. Next up is Penny. Penny, what did you get?
Well, everybody said, a lot of things, which were really wonderful. I mean, when I read it, I focused on the example that Jesus was setting for his disciples when he was washing their feet, which was an act that was, very unexpected. And in the verse, it talks about how Peter, said, "Don't wash my feet," but you almost believe that some of the other disciples were kind of like, they were sticking out their feet, but they were like wondering what was going on. But it does say clearly here that he was going to show them the full extent of his love. So I think that was a really big point, that this was a display of his love for them. And as they've said, a cleaning, not just a cleaning of the physical feet, but this is his he was cleaning them spiritually too. That's what he had done, but he was showing this then in a physical way. I have come, to clean you. And that is the love that I have for you, that I have come to clean you and, make you my own. And just one small point from what Evanique was saying when she was talking about Judas and how Judas, could have said he was sorry, but I think that, I don't think he was sorry. Later on, he may have realized it, but at the time, a lot of times, people think that what they believe is true, and he thought he was saving the Jewish people by giving up, Jesus, because he was, leading them into paths that they didn't want to go in, and creating troubles with the Roman Empire and stuff. And they had everything, established the way they wanted it to be. And so I just was thinking that he could have, but I don't think he had it in his heart, because he did not see it. He still thought, I think, that he was doing what was right. And that's an example, I think, for everybody, I think, maybe to question sometimes if you're, you are not willing to look at what you're doing and to question it and think about it. Because, he had the example of all the 11 disciples who were there, and nobody else was doing this. They all thought that what Jesus was doing was right, but he did not, think again himself, because, wait, maybe I'm not got this right. He was convinced that he had it right. Those are the only points I had.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Add
Go ahead.
one thing
Yes.
briefly.
Yes.
Because I think that Gary touched on it in his presentation, but it's not in the verses 1 through 11. It goes through to verse 15. So may I comment on that?
Please do.
So the one thing is this, it's a standard of behavior higher than the golden rule. You need to be open to receiving the service, as Evanique put it. I thought that was well put. But then there's also in this, if you run through to 15, then there's the ordinance, I think that Gary was talking about, which is, and maybe not, but there is this ordinance in here that if I have done this, just as I have done this to you, so you should do this for other people. So that's, if you will, a carry on. And some people call that a commandment or an ordinance for the disciples to go out and do the same for other people. So that I would just add on, not just to receive the grace, but to share it.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Next up is going to be Joe. And after that, anybody who wants to comment on these verses as a whole is welcome to do that. And then we will go into the discussions of all the points that everybody has raised. Joe, go ahead.
So it's really kind of hard to go after everybody's, because I think everything has pretty much been covered and covered thoroughly. And I appreciate everybody's comments. I think that the most important takeaway that I have, if I were to say, is the fact that Jesus is giving us something to imitate in this process. So he's lowering himself to as a servant, taking this lowly, position. And in a way, he's washing the feet of the disciples, and he's rescuing them right then and there of their pride. What I really thought about with Peter, that no, you'll never wash my feet. And he acts like it's an act of humility, but it's an act of pride. And it's pride in the sense that he says he knows better than God himself. And that he's saying there, that I know that you shouldn't be washing my feet, not you, Lord. And I think pride causes us to do so many unwise acts. It prevents us from practicing virtues. You can't act wisely if your pride is getting in the way. It perverts your thinking. So I think that that's where I see this is, and one significance is that too. There's another significance that Aquinas points out. These are the disciples. These are the people that are following Christ. They've done everything that they've seen the miracles, they believe, they followed Christ all the way to the end. And that their quote, and I believe he writes, they're more perfect than others, but they're still not perfect. And we have this perception of perfect people in the world. And none of us are perfect. And Peter, the one who says, I would never deny you, Christ has made that mistake. And we've all made mistakes we said we'd probably never make. And that is powerful. That is really powerful because we're all susceptible to the devil. I think also the one important thing I think that maybe has not been brought up that Aquinas talks about is how the devil enters into Judas's heart. He gives a whole framework of that he can enter into his mind directly or indirectly. But the really important thing is that he enters in through his thoughts, his imagination, he says. That his imagination and his thoughts start to dominate and they take over his will. And then they become his desire. And I immediately thought of, something that we were talking about just last week with the Gita. right? With understanding the root causes of your desires as part of, knowing your Atman. Why do you desire this? Because it could pervert the truth if you don't know the root cause, and it can pull you away from your center, and it pulls you away from God. And it's the same thing in a way that the devil has perverted the thoughts of Judas and pulled him away. And, for all intents and purposes, maybe he thought he was doing the right thing, but he was betraying the Son of Man. So I think that there's that. I also think that, again, there's something very profound, and this is how you are to treat other people. This is the example that I'm leaving you with. I'm washing your feet. I'm doing something. You're here to serve. You're not here to be served. And that is a very powerful message.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. Next up is going to be Javier. If anybody else wants to comment on these verses as a whole, please go ahead and type exclamation mark. And then once we're done with that, we're going to go into general discussion of all the points that have been raised. Javier, go ahead.
I will concur with Joseph on the way of the pride. And one thing God did is that we had to humble ourselves. Everybody saw Jesus Christ as this high figure. You should not be allowed to do this to me because I'm not in your level. And when he did that, I believe he said, listen, I am who I am, but I still one of you. So when you go up there, don't believe yourself higher than nobody. Humble yourself to anybody. That's what I get from it. Be humble. That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Javier. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to quickly talk about a few points that I got from everybody who spoke, just to jog everybody's memory. And then I'm going to open it up for another round of anybody picking up on anything that you want and talking about it. So Gary talked about this chapter starting with the echo of John 1. I think it's very powerful, that echo, because that sets the entire context. Second, he talked about the style of Gospel of John, of it being narrative theology. Everything here is picked in order to capture the depth of insight about who Jesus is, who God is, who this world is, and who we are. Everything, it's told as a story, but it is a very profound presentation of theology. So narrative theology, thought that was great. He also made the point about the Eucharist. That is a very deep idea, because what essentially you're doing is that you are accepting Jesus in you. You are accepting that as a way of functioning, and him becoming a part of you. So though this gospel doesn't explicitly talk about Eucharist, it is talking only about that. Next, Evanique talked about the importance of doing service and be served. And this is very deep. This is the same idea of, love one another, or in Gita, we talk about namaste, of the God in me greets the God in you. It is a profound respect for the Holy Spirit in each of us as a starting point of interaction. She also talked about the importance of purifying ourselves every day. She talks about Jesus loving his disciples, Jesus loving Judas, Jesus loving Peter. Barron talked about Jesus leaving aside his outer glory, the being unencumbered by the outer glory in order to be, in order to serve, in order to deal with his disciples as brothers. Talked about the cross, the parallels between that, the washing of the feet as being the harbinger of the cross, of the water and blood, the water of John the Baptist converting into the blood of Jesus, which at once cleanses your sin and shows you the path to eternal life, which is nothing but your love of God. I also found his point about the betrayal and denial, betrayal of Judas and denial of Peter to be really interesting, because you can see it in multiple places. So Peter is denying Jesus. He's denying Jesus, after his arrest. And he's also denying Jesus here, saying, I know better than you. I know what you should be doing. Don't do this. And similarly, Judas is doing the same thing when Jesus's feet are being washed with the ointment. He's saying, what is the value of this? I want to put a price on this ointment, and I want that instead. It's the same, it's the price of blood. It's the same thing. It's the betrayal. Brian talked about the golden rule and how this is an upgrade. Moving from law, what is proper, to love and grace and truth. So that is the same pattern. Penny talked about Jesus being an example, a prototype of what you can and should be. She also talked about that I've come to clean you and to make you my own. That is a very beautiful way of capturing it. Joe talked about something to imitate. It's the same point about being the prototype. That's what is being offered, and that he has come to rescue and to realize that all of us are imperfect and all of us need to be purified and to have that love. Javier talked about the humbleness very beautifully. The hierarchy principle. It's saying that the equality principle, that we all have the Holy Spirit in us, is higher principle than a hierarchy principle. So it was just amazing comments. Now I want to open it up for any comments that anybody wants to make. You can pick up any of the themes that you would like and talk about them. Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to share. I'm going to start with Evanique.
Yeah, one thing that I got from what Baron said is looking at Peter and Judas as one and the same. And what I mean is that I think the story of Peter and Judas, especially here, really shows you, basically, I feel like it's the same person. And what I mean by that is that, Peter is very zealous for Christ, right? He's just totally zealous. He totally wants to get it right. And then you see he just a lot of times gets it so wrong. But the thing about Peter is he just keeps trying. And he keeps trying to serve Christ, and he gets there. He is there, but then he has some things that he needs to work on. Judas, like Penny was saying, thought he was doing the right thing. Maybe he was going down the wrong path, but then at the end, and I'm jumping ahead of the story where Judas hangs himself. At some point, he realized, I'm not doing the right thing. But then at that point, he was too prideful to turn back. Like instead of facing what he did, facing the disciples, he chose to commit suicide because he didn't want to deal with it. And I think that's the difference between, I think that's the difference. I think they're the same person symbolically, because we make both choices, maybe not to the extreme that Judas does, but we make choices that sometimes we're humble and we say, okay, I made a mistake or I did this wrong. I will correct myself. Like Peter always had this thing about correcting himself. He always, he wasn't afraid. I had to admire Peter. I have to admire Peter, and that he's not afraid to mess up. And he's also not afraid to correct himself once he realizes that he really messed up. And with Judas, that could be us as well. And that if we choose not to correct the actions that we are taking, it'll lead down a different path. And the path, if you think about it, is away from the center. Peter goes towards the center with all his mistakes and all his gaps and all his attachments. He goes towards the center. And we talked about that in the Gita. He realizes his attachments and he goes towards the center. Judas goes away from the center. He lets the attachments of the world not allow him to humble himself, because at one point he does realize, maybe it wasn't at that moment, but at some point he realized what he did was wrong. And instead of just saying, you know what, I did this, I mean, he tries in the sense that he tries to give the money back to the Pharisees, I think, or the Jewish sect that was trying to kill Jesus. He tries to give the money back. They won't accept it back. I always think, like, at that point, instead of going to hang himself, he could have just went to the cross, right? It just said, I'm sorry. Peter was never afraid to apologize, whereas Judas was. And I think that's where the two separate. It's the choices that they make. But they're us at different moments in our lives.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Evanique. Next up is going to be Brian, Gary, Joe, Baron, and Ella. Brian.
So I will say I misspoke if we're just focusing on this text here. When I incorporated those further lines, there's the ordinance or command is you ought to wash one another's feet. So the apostles amongst themselves ought to wash their feet, each other's feet. So to me, obviously this is a narrative, it is a story, it has significance, and that's been, I think, captured very nicely by what Gary wrote and what everyone else has said. That this narrative, there's something not in the narrative, and it kind of begs the question. Although I have to say, in some ways, maybe it is in the narrative in the story of Judas. What happens to those who do? What happens to you if you do not let Jesus wash your feet? Because the only story we've got here is somebody who let Jesus wash his feet. Do you just should Jesus just leave them alone? What's the I just don't think that question is answered.
Sure. I mean, my quick answer, and everybody's welcome to take it up later on, is it's basically the same as not accepting grace.
Yes.
This is raining on you, and it's your choice. It's that is what you have, the power within you. You have to say yes. If you don't ask, you don't get. So
yeah, but what does what does Jesus do if you do not accept the grace? And by extension, what do the apostles do if that commandment somehow carries on to them? And what does the church do if this is, as Gary suggested, something that's intended for the present time?
Right. Thank you. I mean, it applies to human beings as such, but I'm happy to have, have other people comment on it at a later point. But I want people to comment on things that really resonated with them. Next up is going to be Gary.
I'm actually partly answering Brian's question in that, when we talk about it being a mythical text and having this narrative that stretches back, and this assumed knowledge, which is like all the stories, all the Jewish history, all these stories are just kind of assumed knowledge for John. We do the exact same thing with our church tradition. For 2,000 years, we have this idea of what salvation means. And Thomas Aquinas is writing from his own echo chamber, if you will, within the Catholic Church and Catholic dogma. And so he starts talking about salvation and maybe asking a lot of the questions that you're asking, Brian, which for the most part were not even on the table, that these were not considerations by John. And so part of when we do like let's say a historical critical assessment of it is we're trying to remove, like, get rid of that echo stuff, like really think of like baptism isn't discussed here, so am I bringing this idea myself into it? There's that, and I only think about that because Aquinas talked a lot about the clothing and the putting it off and all that. And the closest parallel is actually in John 10:18, where the same language that is used in John 13, where Jesus takes off the clothing and puts it on again. In John 10:18, he says, I have my life and I can lay it aside and I can pick it up again. And so there's this explicit parallel with the cross and the death going on when he takes off his clothes and puts his clothes back on, when he takes it off and puts it on. I also was thinking of Penny's comment, where she talked about, like, what was going on with Judas, that, he betrays Jesus thinking he's doing the right thing. Even though we think of it as like this post-Reformation ethical thing, utilitarianism and deontology, the Greeks were fully aware of these ethical systems. And in John 11:50, they actually use an utilitarian justification for sending Jesus to the cross. The Pharisees get in this debate, and Caiaphas says, well, it's better that one man should die than that the whole nation should perish. And so there's this debate over, like, what does it mean to do the right thing? And I think what's going on, what we're seeing here in the farewell discourse as a whole, but definitely exemplified through the foot washing, is that idea of this moral, this transformation is, who are we becoming? The question isn't like, what's the right thing to do in a context? It's, who are you becoming? And once you become that, or, I might be totally inappropriately saying is like once I know my Dharma, when I know who I am, then I just do that. Then it becomes more self-evident as you know yourself and as you are internally transformed. But yeah, that's all I have to say there.
Wonderful. I think the dharma and the way, they all go to, it's dharma is the way. So it's very appropriate what you said. Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, Baron, Ella, and DLJ. Joe.
That was pretty profound there, Gary. Actually, I mean, yeah, looking at it from a utilitarian perspective, a little bit earlier. One other thing that I just think that is worth maybe mentioning is also the idea of forgiveness, the importance of forgiveness, as far as washing the feet. You're washing away the sins, but you're also being, given a gift to go out and to forgive, not only with your, with your heart, but with your mind. Fully forgive people. That's, I think, an important part of this is that where you come away from this is that, yes, you're being given a gift. Your sins are being taken away from you. Remember that, because that's how you have to act in the world. And that's how you have to act towards others. So I thought that was an important point to bring up.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Baron.
Yeah, there's a bunch of things that people have said that I've really loved. I guess someone mentioned how Joe talked about how, Peter is acting so humble. But it's actually pride. Like that it's the exact opposite thing as it might appear. I think that was really deep, and there's probably a lot of applications of that, like other places where things that we think we're humble, but it's out of pride and self-reliance and not being willing to accept. Yeah, I think Evanique talking about how Christ is choosing to love these people that he knows are going to deny and betray him. Like what's amazing is even Judas, when Judas comes and betrays him with a kiss, he says, friend, do what you can to do. He addresses him as friend. And ultimately, Judas doesn't accept that, but Christ washing Judas's feet, like it's after this when Judas heads out. So there are things which he only gives to his the 11, but Judas has this also, and that he does, like, what is Christ feeling when he does that? I think Gary said a lot of stuff that's really has given me a ton to think about. Even just that John 10:18 comment, like that's really, I'm glad that I know that also, and like the idea of the orders of a general before battle, that he's giving in the kind of cosmic battle with Satan kind of context here. Though I think my favorite thing was like this being like a transfiguration, like similar and yet the opposite. Instead of his garments becoming blindingly bright, he's taking them off, but it's still in some ways, even in the humility, it's a revelation of his glory, which is maybe even deeper than the transfiguration. I think, and like the parallels he mentioned, where God spoke before, he speaks on the mountain, and he speaks in John 12. I'd be happy, Gary, to hear like those again, and like all of those parallels, because I think that's just I think it's definitely there. It's not just like, oh, this is kind of similar. It's kind of a transfiguration glory like thing, but the opposite. Like it's so clear. So I'd love to hear what else you have on that.
Wonderful, thank you. Gary, if you want to follow up at some point, after Ella and DLG, you're welcome to do that. Lots of people have commented on many things that you said, so you're welcome to follow up on all of those things. But we'll go to Ella and DLJ, and then I will go to Gary. Ella, go ahead.
Sure. I just felt I wanted to say a few words. A lot of it has been covered. Just his egolessness, his humbleness. Jesus was humiliated, deeply traumatized, and betrayed by people that he loved here on the earth. And he knew he was going to die a painful death. And yet, in this psychological state, in all this pain and depression, probably fear, I'm sure, he has the love for humanity and for his disciples who represent humanity to do the final last good things for all of us. And they have endured. So he's setting a lasting example. And he has, in fact, probably, well, I can't say for other people, but I think he has set an example that if they were to go back and the Pharisees were look at their decision again in the context of the moment to go ahead and crucify Jesus because it would save their tribe, their humanity, their city-state, they might think again, because I'm not sure that it did. And his lasting example has been profound over millennia. And the love that prevails, it has been probably the most profound message of the Bible, in my opinion. I was struck by Shukant's invitation for us all to put myself in the place of a disciple, and having Jesus wash my feet. And I just, it's a feeling of, I just had a feeling of like total acceptance and love and truth. And you know, that's, you know, in the deepest and most profound way. So I was really able to get into that and empathize with that. And that's pretty much it. I feel that these two are all parts of us, you know, the best and the worst. We can betray others, and we can forgive others, as Joe mentioned. We can follow Jesus' example in being humble and loving others that may not be like us, or maybe less fortunate, or even those who have betrayed us. And that's really hard to do. So, and then one last point about Gary's talk, it was very informative, and it enabled me to put things in a perspective historically a bit and in context. I appreciate that. But he mentioned that there is a tradition, and it was one of the last things that he covered on his transparency, and I didn't get it down, but it was something about there is a tradition of following and in an attempt to be like Jesus, because I wasn't clear maybe if he could expound upon that, even though we're all, you know, given this example, and hopefully trying to emulate some of his best qualities, you know, to be as Jesus. I don't know. I think I've heard the other thing. I mean, don't even try, you know, don't even go there, you know, God, you're not, you know, you can be a good person. You can be Jesus-like. But I mean, if he could just explain that a little bit more, because that was interesting to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Ella. And Gary, I hope you're keeping notes on things that have been asked of you. We're going to go to DLJ and then to Gary. DLJ.
Thank you. Right. Yeah, Gary, get your pen ready. Got more things for you to write down. Thanks for the presentation. I thought, yeah, pretty much summed it up pretty much as I understood it. I like particularly the writing of then, writing now, writing for the future. That was kind of cool. One thing I was also thinking, though, there's the whole selection process. There's the publishing, right? The editors, right? So as in what ended up in the book and what didn't, right? So then you've got three main traditions: Jewish tradition, Pauline tradition, and obviously deselected the Gnostics that didn't make it into the final cut, right? So this is about legitimization of one set of views over another. And your point about the fact that the author, or authors, we're not actually sure, really, would have read Paul, which is something I hadn't actually crossed my mind before. So I'm thinking, okay, so the washing of the feet part, which is why it's relevant to this bit, right, is very much the Jewish tradition. Do you detect some crossover because they'd read the Pauline stuff? Is in this gospel that wouldn't have been in the earlier ones, the Mark, etc., right? because I might have to reread everything in that context. So you give me some homework to do. So that's the first one. So the selection process and legitimization, one set of views, and the crossover between the Jewish and the Pauline, maybe in this one. The second bit is a kind of key theological thing. It's about free will versus predestiny. So we've got the bit where Jesus not guessed, knew that what Judas was going to do, and also what Peter was going to do in terms of denying him, right? Implying the future is already set, and Judas and Peter don't have free will. And you've got this whole debate that goes on for still going on about the predestiny versus free will, right? Augustine's 4th century, if I remember rightly. So he's the big one on free will, right? And this is way before that, right? So they kind of went for the predestiny angle, not the free will. And I haven't really got anything other than say on that, except I'm curious about your thoughts on that one. So thanks, great for everybody so far. It's been enjoyable.
Thank you, DLJ. Next up is going to be Gary. Gary, please take your time to address anything that you want to address.
So I have all these pieces all over the place, and I'm going to try to assemble them and make sense of them. So historically, here's a good example is Jesus meets this woman at the well. And she says, the Jews say we're supposed to worship on this mountain, and the Samaritans worship at a different mountain. Which one do we worship on? And he says, salvation is of the Jews, but a time is coming and now is when they'll neither worship on this mountain or that mountain, but in spirit and truth. And so we can look at that historically in 33 AD, Jesus talking to the woman at the well. But John's writing in 90 AD after the temple has been destroyed down to its foundation stones, and there's no place for people to worship. The entire system has been obliterated. Similarly, when we look at that utilitarian ethic, as like it's better for one man to die than the whole nation should perish, we're writing literally like 25 or more years after that nation has perished. It's been obliterated. The Romans have come in and tore the whole thing down. And so you have this understood knowledge that we forget, especially if we focus too much on 33 AD, we forget what the socio-political environment was at the time when John wrote all that stuff, and that he's literally commenting on some of this ethics. Like it would just be people who read it would just automatically get it because it's in the water. It's the way it lays out. So yeah, that was something that when Ella mentioned that, I wanted to comment on it, like how that whole dynamic takes place. She also asked about what's going on where the divination, how we become like God. That had a mystical aspect to it, especially in Eastern Orthodox Church. And what's happening is a lot of Protestant theologians are starting to discuss it and explore this idea of theosis. In what way are we becoming divinized, or do we reflect God in ourselves? And keep in mind that we're not just talking about imitation, we're talking about moral transformation, that there's some divine transformation that takes place. So I could give you 3 views on it. But because God has infinite attributes, it's in no way limited by this. One view is that Jesus comes in John 1 with a mission. It's a broken and fallen world that has rejected everyone and everything, but it's the world that, as divine logos, as wisdom, he was also created. And so he's there to redeem and recreate not just people or to bring salvation, through confessing Jesus. He's talking about a renewal of the entire world system. And so when we become like God, that divination means we become like God, and that we take upon ourselves the mission that God has to redeem the whole world. And so it's far more expansive than just asking people to say the Jesus prayer and to accept him into their heart. We're talking about like a phenomenally transformative experience in our lives that just exudes upon the lives of everyone and everything we have in contact with. Another view is, and this was something I think Brian mentioned also, is the parallel between the love command and, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the golden rule. This is definitely based on the same scripture from the Old Testament, Leviticus 19:18, and Deuteronomy 6:4. And that idea that this Deuteronomy 6:4 is the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. The Jewish people have a unity with God as his people, and it's a filial relationship. And throughout the farewell discourse, even though it happens elsewhere in John, it really gets into it as I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, and you are in me, and you will know the Father as I know the Father. And so there's this idea of theosis, and becoming like God means to enjoy the same relationship with God and with Jesus that Jesus enjoys with the Father through the power of the Holy Spirit. And so that's another aspect. A third is really kind of a little bit more mythic, is that Jesus uses temple imagery throughout the whole Gospel of John, where he himself becomes, in the words of Mircea Eliade, the axis mundi, the point in which the cosmic comes in contact with the mundane, where heaven and earth come in contact. And he explicitly says this in, I think, John chapter 1, when he says, you will see the angels of heaven ascending and descending on the Son of Man. That's a reference to Jacob and the Bethel stone that he erects. When Jesus talk about the living water that are pouring out of his gut, we're talking about the millennial temple of Ezekiel and this water that flows out and nourishes all the nations. And so when he says, love one another as I have loved you, by this, all the world, all the nations, everybody will know that you are my disciples and that you love one another. He then goes on in John 15 to say, I am the vine and you are the branches. And so we're enjoined to that vine in that same way. And the fruit that we bear is that love, which is, we become that axis mundi where other people can take that fruit, and they enjoy a relationship with God through the fruit that we bear. And so these are three facets of what it means to have perspectives on theosis, what it means to be like God, and how that might manifest itself. I can honestly say, DLJ, that I can settle your free will predestination argument once and for all. Absolutely, unequivocally. The Old Testament just affirms both without debate and doesn't allow you to choose one or the other. It just says that God is, and good parallels is actually, in our Protestant Bibles, Esther is followed by Job. And the book of Esther does not mention God at all, but he is completely present from beginning to end, orchestrating all of the events. And so there's the sense in his, even if he's not obviously there, he's imminently present. Job, he's mentioned all throughout. And Job is saying, where are you? I can't see you at all. And so he's not mentioned but seen in Esther, and then mentioned but not seen in Job. And both of them affirm the same thing, is that human agency is, we're always held fully accountable for everything we do, but that God is still fully in charge. And I bring that up because the problem of Job is the same problem that John has. Is we're asking the question is why do bad things happen to good people? Jesus created the world. He is wisdom incarnate, and now he's about to be sacrificed. He's about to be killed. He's going to go to the cross by the world that he created. And Job is in that same place. The whole point of Job is that he's a righteous man and doesn't deserve anything that's happening to him. And so between Job and Jesus, they're creating a worldview which accepts that a lot of bad things are going to happen to people without any warrant. And this, I'm not going to stick to this one, but this is, only because we brought it up and Aquinas brought it up. There's a lot of debate on what's taking place when it says that the devil having put it into the heart of Judas to betray him. That the construction could be read, the Greek phrase, that Satan put it into his own heart. He had decided himself that Judas would betray him. And what it does is it actually minimizes Judas's role as just being like an instrument, and that the real battle that's taking place is between Jesus and the devil and Jesus and Satan. And one of the arguments for that is also when you look at the end of the dialogue, when Judas leaves, it says, and then Satan entered him, and it was night. And so they say, well, it didn't happen until then, not until after he hands him the morsel is when Satan enters him. But that's neither here nor there. It all depends on how much emphasis we want to place on the cosmic battle aspect of it, and that the two battles, there's that general thing going on. It's Jesus and Satan are sitting there, they're squaring it off, and Satan moves his troop, and Jesus washes the feet. And what seems like a defeat for Jesus is actually his victory. It's the splendor of God being revealed on the cross. So did I answer all of your questions?
Yes, looks like. So Gary, that was just brilliant. This is just beautiful. Thank you so much. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to plan for the next time. We'll continue with the same format. Okay, we'll continue with the same format. I strongly recommend reading Aquinas because he adds so much richness, so much context to it. We will go lectures by lectures, we'll go verses by verses in the same pattern that Aquinas had. So I thought that this was just a fantastic beginning of a great new series. If you have any kind of comments on the series itself, and what do you think about it, you're welcome to say. Let's start with Evanique. If anybody else wants to talk just about this entire series now, and what are they thinking about it, go ahead and type ! We'll start with Evanique. Evanique, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm all in. I really like the aspect that Gary brings, the historical aspect and the narratives and the history behind it. And Baron has some great thoughts as well. Everybody really had amazing thoughts. One of the things that, like you said, we never finished the Gospel of John and studying Aquinas. So I think this is a good way to do it. And I just think that this will be amazing to break this down and to really see what the Gospel of John is about, what Aquinas had to say about it, and what other people have been saying about it. Like Gary did a master's on one chapter. Like, that's just amazing to me. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I got a lot out of it. It made my Bible study so much deeper doing this. So thank you, Shurkant, for suggesting this and making this happen. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Evanique and David, for being the co-host. So if I can't make it during, I can't make it all the time, you guys can step in. It's wonderful. Okay, would love to hear from anybody else. Next, it's going to be Brian, followed by Joe. Brian.
Well, I just wanted to say I was really impressed with and I thank Gary for the slides he put together. I know that's a lot of work and there's a lot of thought that went into them. And I really like the perspective he brought. I appreciate the historical, literary, and theological. So I do hope that when you talk about a series in the future, I hope it is including Gary.
Oh yes, absolutely. It's wonderful. Gary, you were magnificent. And this is just great because this is like a combination. I mean, we are not academics, okay? But at the same time, you are a very unusual academic. I hate to tell you this, Gary, but you're a very unusual academic because you are actually able to talk like a human being in spite of being an academic. You're able to take all that learning and make it accessible. For example, the way in which you answered the questions, that was just fantastic. And in your presentation, the historical context that you brought and say, okay, this is the context in which John is being written, that was just brilliant. So just always delighted to have you here, of course. Okay, next up is Joe.
I liked it a lot. I mean, I appreciated everybody's comments, and I would hope everybody can make it back as well to the subsequent sessions. I really thought that you know, obviously Gary Barron, you know, brought in a new dynamic to the group, and this has really been yeah, I really enjoyed it. So I'm looking forward to, you know, getting into this, and I really did get into Aquinas this time. So that was good. I was able to
Wonderful.
commune with the text a little better.
Thank you. Gary, how was it?
I really enjoyed it. I was quite honestly nervous, and I'm happy to send the slides to you if anybody wants them. You can email them or however else. I don't have a problem with that at all. No, I really enjoyed it. So I'm not quite finished with my degree. I finished my first draft, and now it's all editing. And so when you called me up and asked me to do this, I was like, oh, this is perfect, because now I'm just focusing on what I'm doing. And my focus actually it's focused on John 13, but it's more of that idea of theosis, as being that John's particular ethic is about us being transformed into a likeness of God. That is this multifaceted thing, and that there's a unique ethic in the gospel.
Speak a little bit more about your thesis. Tell us about what you're doing with the thesis.
So I my first degree was in nursing, and so I had a master's in nursing, and I worked a lot in psychology. And so what I'm actually doing is a multidisciplinary approach to the foot washing and the Gospel of John, and that I'm looking at is like, how does ethics really plan out in the world? And the truth of the matter is that we can set up experiments. You're gonna follow your gut instinct, basically your self-interest, and then after the fact, you're gonna create an ethical paradigm to justify what you already decided was in your best interest, and then you're gonna say, "See, I acted ethically." Whether it's a utilitarian approach or a deontological, you're gonna go back and forth on that. Also, people have a really high view of their own morals. Like if you ask 100 people, are you a moral person? They'll all say, like 90% of them will say that they're more moral than the other 90%. And the math doesn't pan out. We all have this inflated ego when it comes to our own moral identity. And so what I'm exploring is a way to understand the Gospel of John that compels us towards that humility, where we stop thinking so highly of ourselves, that has what is considered like a more normative ethic, at least in the context of being a Christian. Like what does this really mean?
Let me give you a summary of what we learned since last time you were here. Because since last time you were here, we finished Tao Te Ching, we finished Bhagavad Gita, and what we learned is that this wisdom tradition, you're making the point that you're making the point that different things are very different in the history. So different works, and you have to understand it in their historical context. What we found is that these wisdom traditions approach everything that they do in an integrated manner. So the people, their emotions, their thoughts, their actions are all integrated. And the integration is so, I mean, the way in which I experience it, especially in John, is the sheer beauty of it. It's like that one action, and how much is being carried by that one action. And that happens, again and again and again and again. And then on the top of that, it's like a symphony. So it's like there will be the action of Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman, and there is the washing of the feet, and then there is the cross. And there are all these parallels. It's like some themes are added here, some themes are added there, then something like the cross will bring all of that together. It's like it's like a Beethoven symphony. It's like the finale that brings in all the little themes that you were seeing throughout. So it's just, it's just so incredible, and it's wonderful to have you here. And thank you very much, everybody. This has been just fantastic. Brian, you want to have some final comment? Go ahead.
Oh, well, I'm happy that, I don't want to interrupt, but I just want to say I feel like Gary could really add a lot if he continues to come because he's got a tremendous background in this subject.
Absolutely, absolutely. I would be delighted. Gary, what do you think? You'll be able to make many of them?
Is it every Thursday at 6?
Every Thursday. Every Thursday at this. Okay.
That's the plan.
Perfect. I'm telling you, you're going to add to your thesis as a result of this, because it's going to make you, because all these folks, right? I mean, the thing about them is that they have, this is what is unique about this group, is that each person communes with the text, from their heart and with fullness of their mind. And they're always thinking about what does it mean for their actions. And because it is multiple perspectives, each person is actually bringing, and everybody feels comfortable expressing the deepest thoughts that they have. And we come from such different backgrounds, such different, places that, it's very rich. So I think your thesis is going to read better. It's not going to change your research, but it is going to have the meaning of it. People are going to want to read it more 20 years from now. You're talking about people reading and writing over time. So that's what it's going to do. Go ahead, Gary.
Partly it's a comment to DLJ in answer to part of his question. There's this lady named Eileen Pagels who wrote extensively on Gnosticism and focused especially on cosmic battle and cosmic war and stuff like that. And so the introduction of Satan for her is a very Gnostic light darkness parallel, something like that. But no, thank you. That's actually the whole reason why I went to college, back to college, and to write this thesis was because I'm trying to tackle this problem. Because I'm frustrated in how many Christians I know from even my own Bible college who have just they're ethically all over the place. They just do what they want and then they justify it after the fact. And I was just like, there's got to be a way to understand this text that's meaningful or more consistent, and that's Wonderful. What I'm struggling for.
Wonderful. DLJ, let's wrap it up on this note of kind of a larger point, and we'll see you next Thursday, folks. See you. There are some incredible things taking place. Let's see. What's taking place on tomorrow? Brian and Evanique are going to be here, and they're going to be discussing the divine feminine. What happened to goddesses in the wisdom tradition of the West. I'll give them a chance to talk a little bit about that. Next, we're going to have Mark Stallman and Fred Butler back. Fred Butler is the head of the Great Books program at University of Chicago. Mark Stallman is the head of the Center for the Study of Digital Life. They are launching a new university called TrivU, based on the Trivium, and they're doing a series of 4 lectures. They're launching the university right here at 52 Living Ideas. It's going to be on Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. This time it's going to be the lectures are going to start with, the first one is going to be on the roots of the current crisis of meaning. The second one is about navigating multiple paradigms. The third one is about a new way of thinking using the Trivium, etc. And the fourth one is going to be on 3 spheres, East, West, and digital, and how they interact with one another. So it's going to be something. So don't miss that one. We have many things going on, but I'm going to have Evanique, if you could just within a minute, talk about what you're going to talk about tomorrow.
Sure. So basically, what came up on the last series, on the last meetup on Divine Feminine, there were several questions related to what happened to the Western goddess, what happened to the goddess in Western tradition, like why was the goddess dropped? So Brian put together a great presentation about why he and Penny did some great research. I'm going to comment as well, but it was some great research on why that happened. We wanted to address it because it came up so many times in the meetup. So we're deviating from the Isabella Price book this week. to do that. But so we're going to discuss what happened to the goddess in Western tradition. So come join us. Brian and Penny, I will say, did the lion's share of the work this time. And so it's going to be a great presentation.
Wonderful. Brian and Penny, do you want to make a quick comment? You're welcome to do that. Otherwise, we're all set. I think we'll just see you tomorrow. I don't want to. Brian, do you want to say anything? No. Okay. Very good. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Delightful. Gary, special thanks to you. We'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.